An old woman cried for help as two cops slammed her to the ground. No one moved until a silent figure stepped from the shadows. Keanu Reeves didn't come for a fight, but what he saw made walking away impossible. What happened next would ignite a national firestorm and expose a truth no one was ready for. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The wind drifted gently across MacArthur Park that afternoon, carrying the faint scent of roses, city dust, and the soft laughter of children in the distance. Keanu Reeves sat alone on a weathered bench near the north edge of the park, a paper cup of jasmine tea warming his hands. He wore a faded hoodie pulled low, a pair of dark sunglasses, and the kind of quiet that invited no attention. That was the point. He had just come from a youth center downtown, spent the morning reading to kids whose eyes hadn't seen peace in weeks. This was his moment to breathe. The sun hovered low, casting streaks of gold across the surface of the lake. Ducks bobbed quietly by the edge, and a young couple passed behind him, laughing softly. Everything was still, peaceful. Until it wasn't. A sharp voice snapped through the air like a whip. Then another, male, harsh, something about identification. Keanu's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. The voices came from just up the walking path, beyond a small cluster of palms. He heard the unmistakable shuffle of feet on gravel, and then, "You can't sit here all day, lady. You hear me?" A man barked. Keanu's head tilted slightly in the direction of the sound. His body stayed still, but every sense came alive. The years had trained him too well. "No ID, huh? What do you have in that bag then?" Another voice followed. Younger, less controlled, impatient. Keanu carefully set the cup down on the bench beside him. A moment later, he saw them. Two officers, uniforms crisp, badges glinting in the afternoon light. Officer Trent Thickset, with buzzed blonde hair and a squared jaw. Officer Colby taller, lankier, his hands twitching with restless energy. Between them, a woman, elderly, Hispanic. Her back hunched ever so slightly from age, her hands trembling visibly as she clutched a reusable grocery bag close to her chest. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. Her eyes were wide with confusion. One of her shoes was untied. Her face was thin and lined, but dignified. She wore a tattered cardigan and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Keanu's eyes caught a glimpse of something in her hand. A photograph, folded and yellowing with time. It looked like an old military portrait. Her husband? She didn't speak fast enough for Officer Trent. "I said, stand up!" he shouted. She shook her head slowly, trying to explain, her voice so faint it didn't carry. Trent reached down and yanked her upright by the elbow. A sharp, startled cry escaped her lips as her shoulder gave way under the force. Keanu saw her knees buckle. Her bag fell. The old photo fluttered to the ground. Officer Colby stepped in next, grabbing her grocery bag and digging through it without consent. "You think we're stupid?" he muttered, loud enough for bystanders to hear. "Probably holding something in here. What's this crack? Pills? Huh?" The woman's eyes widened in horror. No, just food. That's food for my birds. Please." Her voice cracked. No one moved. Keanu didn't blink. Officer Trent shoved the woman backward. Her frail legs stumbled over the curb of the path. She fell, hard hands scraping against the concrete, her cardigan catching on the jagged edge of a bench post. Blood appeared quickly on her knees. Her head narrowly missed the pavement. Gasps rippled through the park. Still, no one moved. People stopped, stared. A young man with earbuds pulled them out and started recording with his phone. A woman with a stroller froze mid-step, covering her child's eyes. Two teenagers whispered something about calling for help, but they didn't. No one did, except Keanu. He was still sitting, but now his hands were on his thighs. His jaw was locked. His eyes didn't leave the scene, not for a second. Officer Colby crouched beside the injured woman, yanked her wrists behind her back, and pulled out his handcuffs. "You're resisting," he muttered, like a rehearsed script. "We warned you," she cried out again, begging them to stop, her voice barely audible. "Please, I didn't do anything. I was just sitting here. You're loitering in a city park, refusing orders from law enforcement." That's enough for an arrest. Trent spat as Colby locked the cuffs around her wrists, tightening them until her hands turned red. The elderly woman, Rosalía Ortega, tried to raise her head. She looked around at the people watching, eyes full of silent pleas. Her lip trembled, the pain obvious, but more than that, the humiliation. Colby leaned in closer. You want to sell dope? Do it somewhere else, not in front of families. Keanu's breath left his body slowly, quietly, like the final warning of a gathering storm. He stood up. No dramatic gesture, no sudden move. He simply stood. He picked up his teacup, walked it over to a trash bin, and dropped it in. Then he turned and began walking toward them, steady, focused, like a shadow moving across the ground with purpose. Trent noticed him first. Keep walking, sir. Police matter. Keanu didn't stop. Colby looked up. You deaf? Move along. This doesn't concern you. He kept walking. The woman looked up again, this time into Keanu's face. Her eyes searched for something. Recognition, maybe. Or just hope. Maybe the smallest flicker that someone was about to care. She whispered, "Help me." That was the moment. Not the voices, not the push, not the cuffs. That whisper, that fragile, broken plea from a woman old enough to be anyone's grandmother. Keanu Reeves, still silent, still calm, stopped just a few feet away. The officers stood over her like wolves over fallen prey. But now, something shifted. The crowd began to grow behind Keanu. More people pulled out their phones. A man in a suit slowed his pace and watched. An older woman stepped forward with concern etched across her face. Keanu looked down at Rosalía. Then, slowly turned his eyes to Trent. His voice came out low, measured. You're going to let her go. Trent straightened his posture, puffing out his chest like a man who thought a badge gave him unlimited power. Excuse me? He snapped, trying to size Keanu up. Do you even know who you're talking to? Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. His expression stayed neutral, but there was something in his stance, something immovable, a stillness that made people quiet. You're interfering with law enforcement, Colby said, stepping forward. Back off before we arrest you too. Keanu glanced down at the woman still trembling on the ground. Her cheek was bruised, her wrist bent at a strange angle inside the cuff. Her eyes had glassed over, but not from pain, from resignation, like she'd already accepted how the rest of this would go, like this wasn't the first time the world had tried to break her. He looked back up at the two men. Calm voice, clear words. She's injured, she's elderly, and she's done nothing wrong. You know it, I know it, everyone watching knows it. Colby's mouth curled into a sneer. Who do you think you are, huh? Her lawyer? A voice from the crowd shouted. That's Keanu Reeves. The tension in the air snapped like a cable under strain. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Phones lifted higher. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, it's really him." But Keanu didn't blink. He didn't acknowledge the name. That wasn't why he was here. Trent took a step forward. Doesn't matter who you are. If you don't walk away, you'll do what? Keanu interrupted, his voice still composed. Push me like you pushed her? Slam me to the pavement because I didn't move fast enough? He didn't move from his spot between them and Rosalía. I'm not here to fight you, he said. I'm here because no one else did. A hush fell over the park. Every eye was on him. Even the birds had gone quiet. Rosalía's fingers twitched, her lips parting again. My husband fought in the war, she whispered, barely audible. That photo in the bag. Keanu reached down and gently picked up the photo that had fallen. He brushed the dirt off the glass. A black and white portrait of a man in uniform. Strong, proud. He held it carefully, like it meant something. Then he looked back at the officers. She came here to sit on the bench where they used to meet. She came here to remember him, Colby scoffed. For all we know, that's fake. Doesn't prove anything. It proves she's human, Keanu said softly. The crowd shifted. Phones recording, eyes wide. Not one person looked away. Keanu took a final step forward, planting himself like a wall. You're going to let her go, he repeated, this time with steel in his voice. Officer Trent hesitated. Colby's jaw tightened. But Keanu stood there, calm and unyielding, a quiet storm gathering behind his eyes. He wasn't asking again, and the whole park knew it. Officer Colby's hand hovered near his holster. His face was flushed, nostrils flaring as if trying to puff himself up in front of the growing crowd. He stepped forward, his shadow overlapping Keanu's. "Back away. Final warning," he growled. Keanu didn't budge. Instead, he calmly pointed to Rosalia's wrists, which were turning red where the metal cut into her skin. "What crime did she commit?" he asked, voice steady and quiet. Trent scoffed, folding his arms. She was sitting where she shouldn't have been, looked suspicious. "Matched a description." Keanu raised an eyebrow behind his sunglasses. Suspicious how? Colby glanced at the crowd, suddenly realizing how many cameras were now pointed at them. Still, he didn't back off. "You really want to do this? Right here? Right now?" Keanu nodded once. "If it means getting her help, yes, right here, right now." Trent looked down at Rosalía, as if trying to justify their actions. She didn't answer our questions. She was evasive. "She's 76, Keanu said. "She's scared." "You didn't ask, you accused." He slowly lowered himself to one knee beside Rosalía. She looked at him with disbelief in her eyes, as if she still couldn't believe someone had stepped in. He spoke softly, brushing a bit of gravel away from her elbow. "You okay, ma'am?" She nodded slowly, eyes watering. "My shoulder hurts," she whispered. "They pulled me too hard." Keanu turned his gaze back up to the officers. "You're hurting her. That's enough." Colby's jaw clenched. She didn't obey a lawful order. She was loitering. Loitering isn't a reason to throw someone to the ground, and it sure as hell isn't a reason to draw blood. Behind them, murmurs swelled again. A teenage girl whispered, "Is that really Keanu Reeves?" Her friend nodded, filming wide-eyed. A middle-aged man took off his baseball cap and moved closer. Another man said aloud, "This ain't right. They better let her go." Keanu stayed between Rosalía and the officers, kneeling as a shield. His voice was still low, but it carried weight. "If you have no probable cause, you need to release her. She has rights." "She matched a description," Trent repeated, almost stubbornly. "What description?" Keanu asked. "Old? Brown? Alone?" Trent flinched, but didn't respond. Keanu stood again, slowly, his hands visible, his posture open but resolute. "You're escalating a situation that didn't need escalation. This woman was sitting on a bench. That's not a crime." Colby looked around, the tension crawling into his spine. He could feel the phones aimed at his face, the voices rising. Keanu kept his eyes locked on both men. "She deserves dignity, not a pair of cuffs and a sidewalk injury. So I'm asking again, let her go." Trent pointed a finger toward Keanu's chest. "You're interfering with law enforcement. You want to be arrested?" Keanu stared at him, unmoved. "Then you'd better make it worth it." The moment those words left Keanu's mouth, the entire atmosphere changed. No one in the park was talking now. The murmurs had faded into silence. The only sounds were the rustling leaves above and the faint, steady breathing of Rosalía on the ground. The tension was thick, like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. Officer Trent's face twisted into a grimace. "You think you're untouchable just because you're famous?" he said, stepping forward. "That don't work here. You don't get to play hero in the real world." "I'm not playing anything," Keanu replied evenly. "I'm stopping something that should have never started." Colby looked toward the growing crowd. Dozens of phones were raised now, recording every word, every movement. He wiped sweat from his brow, visibly shaken. "This is going to blow up," he muttered under his breath to Trent. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried like thunder. "What you saw, what you're seeing right now, this isn't how it's supposed to work," someone called out. "They're abusing her." Another shouted, "She was just sitting there." A young man in a red hoodie added, "This is messed up." Trent tried to raise his voice. Over the crowd, "Back up, all of you. You're obstructing a police investigation." Keanu didn't flinch. "Then show them the investigation," he said. "Tell us the crime. Show us the evidence. Because right now, All I see is fear and power being misused." Rosalía tried to sit up, wincing as she shifted her shoulder. Keanu knelt again to steady her. She clung to his arm. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "I won't," he said quietly. Trent drew a step closer, fists balled at his sides. "We warned you. Step away from her, or you're next." The threat hung in the air, ugly and loud. Keanu stood again, slowly. His voice never rose. "If doing the right thing means getting arrested, then go ahead. But know this. Every camera here, every person watching, they're going to remember what you did. And what you didn't." Colby's fingers hovered near his taser. "We don't need this kind of heat," he muttered to Trent again. Trent hissed. "We can't back down now." Keanu heard both of them. His arms rested calmly at his sides, but his stance never shifted. "You're already in too deep," he said. "Don't make it worse." Then came the first chant from the crowd. "Let her go. Let her go." Others joined in, dozens, then more. "Let her go. Let her go." Colby's eyes darted across the sea of people. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, unignorable. Keanu didn't move. He stood like a pillar in the middle of a storm. And behind him, Rosalía whispered his name, not as a celebrity, but as her only protector, Keanu. Trent took a deep breath, clearly wrestling with the moment. His hand twitched near his radio, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. The chant behind him was growing louder, echoing across the park. "Let her go! Let her go!" Keanu remained still, calm. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to shout or gesture. His presence alone, rooted and unshakable, had already become the eye of the storm. Colby looked at Trent again, this time with real uncertainty. "We've got 50 cameras on us," he muttered. "If we touch him, we're finished." Trent clenched his jaw. "If we back off, we look weak." Keanu turned slightly toward them again. "This isn't about looking weak," he said. "It's about doing what's right. A 76-year-old woman is bleeding on the sidewalk because of your actions. That's what everyone's seeing. That's what they'll remember." Rosalía coughed softly and tried to sit up again. Keanu moved instantly, kneeling beside her, steadying her with both hands. "You're safe now," he said gently. "You're not alone." One of the teens from the crowd moved closer. "They need to call an ambulance," she said. "She's hurt." Keanu nodded without looking away from the officers. "Call one," he said. "Now." Trent didn't move. Keanu stood up again, his eyes locked on them. "I asked what crime she committed," he said. "You gave me nothing. So unless you're prepared to justify your actions legally, publicly, and ethically, you're going to uncuff her. Or I'll make sure this becomes the story the entire country talks about tomorrow." Colby's breath caught. He glanced at the cuffs on Rosalie A's wrists, the blood on her knees, the bruises forming on her arm. Then he looked back at the crowd. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only anger and truth. Keanu stepped closer, not aggressive, but direct. "This isn't about me. This is about her. Every second you leave those cuffs on is another second of damage you'll never undo." The chant erupted again. "Let her go! Let her go!" Trent's shoulders fell. For the first time, he looked like a man who realized he was losing. Rosalía shifted again. "Please," she whispered. "I just wanted to sit with my husband's photo." That was the final crack. Keanu extended a hand, palm open. "Give me the receiver key," he said. "Or do it yourself. But this ends now." Trent didn't speak, but after a long moment, Colby reached into his pocket. The cuffs clicked open. Rosalía inhaled sharply as the metal released its grip. Keanu caught her wrist and gently rubbed the red mark, supporting her like she was royalty. The crowd erupted into cheers. But Keanu didn't turn to the noise. He was focused only on her. He whispered something to Rosalía, soft, reassuring. And the chant changed. "Keanu, Keanu, Keanu." But he didn't smile. He just helped her to her feet and turned back toward the officers. And without raising his voice, he said the one thing that shut everything down. "You were supposed to protect her." Long before blood ran down her knees, long before two officers hurled words like weapons and steel bit into her wrists. Rosalía Ortega was just a girl with a dream. She had come to America in 1965, leaving behind the dry, cracked soil of Guanajuato, Mexico. Her father had died young, and her mother worked herself sick, scrubbing hotel floors. But Rosalía believed in something better, something possible. So she crossed the border with a suitcase full of hand-sewn dresses, a rosary in her pocket, and hope clutched like oxygen in her chest. The first few years were hard. She slept on floors, shared rooms with strangers, learned English one word at a time from telenovelas and church bulletins. But she worked. Lord, how she worked. 6 days a week, in a garment factory near downtown Los Angeles. Her hands turned raw from threading machines. Her back bent from hours hunched over stiff cloth. But she kept going. Every paycheck, no matter how small, went to survival then, slowly, to progress. First, a one-room apartment, then a better one, then night school. She met Miguel in 1970. He was quiet, kind, a widowed war veteran with tired eyes and a limp from a German bullet that never fully healed. They met at a church picnic where he spilled orange soda on her skirt and apologized so earnestly she couldn't help but laugh. He didn't have much, but he treated her like she was everything. They married under a rented arch covered in plastic flowers. Miguel gave her a ring he'd bought from a pawn shop, and she wore it like it was made of diamonds. Together they raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Rosalía sewed through the nights so Miguel could work days at the post office. They lived modestly, but proudly. No handouts, no debt, just faith and hard work. Every Sunday, without fail, they came to this park. MacArthur Park. Same bench, same spot, under the sycamore tree. Miguel would bring bread for the birds. Rosalía would bring iced café de olla in a thermos and quietly knit while he told stories to the kids about the war. Not the gory parts, just the noble ones, the ones that made them sit up straighter. When he died in 2004, she thought the world had ended. She didn't leave the house for weeks. Then one Sunday, her granddaughter placed the old photograph in her hand. Miguel, in uniform, standing tall, like the man she remembered. "Go sit on the bench, abuelita," she said. "He's still there. You'll feel it." And so she did. Every Sunday after church, without fail, Rosalía came to that bench. Saturday, in silence, held his photo in one hand and crumbs in the other for the pigeons. It was their way of still being together. Today had been no different, until the officers came. Rosalía had never broken a law in her life. She didn't drink. She didn't curse. She didn't speak, unless spoken to in English, out of respect and fear, because decades had taught her that being quiet meant being safe. But that morning something had shifted. She'd woken up before dawn, lit the candle next to Miguel's photo like always, and brewed a fresh pot of cinnamon coffee. Her bones ached more than usual, but she ignored them. She wore her best cardigan, the maroon one with the sewn-on elbow patches, and pinned Miguel's Medal of Service inside her purse next to his picture. She stopped by the cemetery first to clean his grave. Then she walked to the park, the same as every Sunday. The moment she sat down on the bench, she felt his presence. She always did. The sunlight filtered through the branches just like it had when they were young. The breeze was soft, whispering through the leaves. She held the photo in her hand, whispering softly in Spanish, updating him on the family, on how their granddaughter had made the honor roll, on how she still had trouble sleeping without his snores in the room. Then, without warning, the peace shattered. She heard the boots before she saw the men, the barked command, the sharp voice, demanding her identification. At first, she didn't think they were talking to her. She was just sitting. She wasn't bothering anyone. But when she turned and met their eyes, Trent's and Colby's, something in their expression told her this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. This was a decision. She had lived through times like these before. She remembered 1978, when a neighbor was stopped and frisked for walking home from work with too many groceries. She remembered 1980, 986, when her son was thrown against a fence by a cop who claimed he fit the profile just for having brown skin and headphones. She remembered every slight, every go back to where you came from, every side glance in the store, every time someone looked through her like she didn't exist, or worse, like she was a threat. But she never imagined it would happen to her. Not here, not now, not at 76, not on that bench. She tried to explain, tried to show them the photo, tried to speak clearly, but her voice shook, her hand trembled. Her words, though soft, were not enough for men who had already decided what they wanted to see. She remembered the weight of Trent's hand on her arm, how it didn't feel like help. It felt like removal. She remembered the pain shooting through her shoulder, the ground tearing her skin, the taste of concrete dust in her mouth. And then, she remembered the silence. No one helped, until him. At first, Rosalía thought she was hallucinating. The voice that spoke didn't shout or threaten. It was calm, firm, but kind. A voice that didn't bark orders, but asked questions. That treated her like a person, not a problem. She looked up from the ground, blinking past the glare of the sun, and saw a man standing between her and the officers. He wore dark jeans and a hoodie. Sunglasses shaded his eyes, but even without seeing them, she could feel something different. Not fear, not pity, just presence. She had no idea who he was. She didn't care. He stood in front of her like he'd been sent for this one purpose, to keep her from disappearing. When he knelt beside her and picked up the photo of Miguel from the ground, she nearly wept. He held it so gently. He brushed off the dirt like it was gold. And then he looked at her, not past her, not through her, but directly into her eyes. "Are you hurt?" Those were his first words. Not, "What's your name?" or "Why are you here?" Not, "Do you have ID?" or "Are you a citizen?" Just simple concern. Like she mattered. She tried to answer, but her voice cracked. Her shoulder throbbed. The cuffs were digging into her bones. But still he didn't leave. He stayed there, stood tall, argued for her with no anger, only truth. She heard his voice cut through the officer's excuses. She heard the crowd behind him swell. She heard the word Keanu murmured over and over again, like some kind of name the world respected. But to her, in that moment, he wasn't an actor. He wasn't a celebrity. He was a man who chose not to look away. And that was all she'd ever wanted, all she'd ever needed. Someone not to look away. Now, as the officers stepped back and the cuffs clicked loose, she felt the full weight of everything crash down. Her body shook, her shoulders screamed, her knees burned. But none of it mattered more than the tears running down her face. She wasn't invisible. Not today. She gripped the man's arm as he helped her to her feet. He moved slowly, supporting her with quiet strength. Her photo was back in her hand, carefully returned, like a piece of her soul restored. He walked her to the bench again. Their bench. And as she sat down, breath shallow, heart racing, she looked up at him again. "You don't know what you've done for me," she whispered. Keanu didn't answer. He simply nodded, eyes steady, his back straight, as he turned once more to face the officers behind him. And in that moment, Rosalía knew the truth. She had spent her whole life surviving, but now, someone was finally standing. Officer Trent's eyes were burning now, but not with authority, only with frustration. His jaw twitched, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a civilian, especially not in front of a crowd. "You're interfering with an active situation," he snapped again. She matched a description, and we acted accordingly. Keanu stood tall, his hands by his sides. His voice didn't rise, didn't tremble. "What description?" Trent didn't answer. Keanu took a step forward, calm and slow. What description did she match? Exactly. Colby cut in, louder now. It came through dispatch this morning. Elderly woman, Hispanic, suspected of loitering and possible drug activity in the area. Keanu looked down at Rosalía, sitting silently on the bench, holding a photograph of her late husband like it was the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Her cardigan was still half hanging from her shoulder, her knees still bleeding. She hadn't said a word since the cuffs came off. Keanu turned back toward the officers. "You think that's enough? Old, brown, and sitting quietly in a park? That's the profile?" Colby looked flustered. "You don't know what it's like. What we have to deal with every day." Keanu didn't blink. "Neither do you. You don't know what she's carried, what she's lived through. And you didn't ask. You assumed." Trent stepped closer. "Are you trying to paint us as racists now?" "No," Keanu said. "You did that yourselves the moment you threw her to the ground and treated her like a threat." Behind them, a woman's voice shouted from the crowd. "We saw everything." A man near the front raised his phone higher. Got it all on video. A few people started muttering louder now, fueled by what they'd witnessed. The crowd had grown. At least 30 people were watching now. Some with outrage in their eyes, others with disbelief, all of them with phones recording. Keanu turned to them and asked, "Are you still filming?" Several hands went higher in response. The officers hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any defense they could have tried to make. "You're scared," Keanu said plainly. "But not of her, not of me. You're scared of being seen, finally seen." Colby's lips parted, ready to argue, but nothing came out. Trent's radio crackled, but he ignored it. His focus was locked on Keanu now, and his pride was too bruised to let go. "You think just because you're famous you can push us around?" he barked. "You're not above the law." Keanu shook his head once. "Neither are you." Then Colby's hand twitched too fast, too sharp. He reached for his taser. Keanu saw it, and he didn't run, didn't back down. Instead, he raised one hand, not in surrender, but as a shield. Keanu's hand hovered in the air, steady and open. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't fear. It was a line drawn in silence. The entire park froze. Colby hesitated with the taser still holstered, his fingers wrapped tightly around the grip. His breathing had changed, shallow, erratic. He wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. "Don't," Keanu said, voice calm. "You know this won't end the way you think." Trent stepped closer, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "We gave you every chance to walk away. Now you're forcing our hand." Keanu didn't budge. "No one forced you to throw a woman to the ground. No one forced you to humiliate her in front of children. This is your choice. Every second that passes is your decision." Behind him, someone in the crowd shouted, "You pull that taser, you'll lose your job." Another voice, older, deeper, cut through the tension. "She wasn't doing anything. We were here. We saw it all." Rosalía clutched the photograph to her chest now, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Her hands trembled, but she didn't speak. She just stared at the man standing in front of her. The man who hadn't raised a fist, hadn't shouted, but had turned an entire crowd with nothing but truth and conviction. Colby's hand slowly slipped away from the taser. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, then toward Trent. He was losing his grip on the narrative, and he knew it. Keanu lowered his hand. The tension in his body remained, but he never looked away. "You're scared of being caught doing the wrong thing," he said. "That's why you're angry. That's why you're reaching for weapons instead of answers." Trent muttered something under his breath, then turned sharply toward the crowd. "Everyone needs to back up. This is still an active investigation." "No, it's not," a woman shouted back. "It's harassment. It's violence." A group of college students who had gathered near the fountain began chanting again. "Let her be! Let her be!" Keanu's voice broke through the noise once more. "The question isn't whether you can keep going. It's whether you should." Colby's head dropped for a second. Just a second. Then he turned away and stared at the ground like he was waiting for someone to tell him what to do. Trent looked between them. Keanu, the crowd, the cameras, the bleeding woman on the bench. He was cornered, but still not willing to admit defeat. "You don't scare me," Trent said, stepping forward again. Keanu's voice didn't rise. "I don't have to." Then he added something else, slower, sharper. "But if you make the wrong move again, every eye here will make sure the world knows your name for the wrong reasons." Trent stopped, and for the first time, he blinked like he understood he was out of control. The crowd closed in, not physically, but with presence. The chants faded into a heavy silence, the kind that made every heartbeat feel louder than it should. Keanu stood in the center of it all, shoulders square, voice quiet, eyes unwavering. Rosalía sat just behind him, her fragile frame now leaning against the bench, her breath labored but calmer than before. A teenage girl stepped forward and draped a jacket gently over her shoulders. Keanu gave the girl a quick nod. She nodded back, eyes wide with something between admiration and disbelief. Colby, still silent, had backed away, clearly shaken. The weight of the moment was pressing into his chest. His fingers twitched at his side, no longer on his taser, just twitching. Trent, however, was still clinging to the illusion of control. He straightened, chin high, but his voice cracked as he barked out his next words. "You're not the law here, Reeves. You think being a celebrity gives you power?" Keanu took one step forward, slow and deliberate. "Power doesn't come from a badge," he said. "It comes from what you do when no one's watching." But today, everyone island, a ripple moved through the crowd again. One man shouted, "It's over. Let it go." A woman added, "You're digging yourself deeper." Trent's eyes darted across the park. He saw the phones, the cameras, the dozens of eyes locked on him. He wasn't just being filmed. He was being watched by a public that had already begun forming its verdict, and he was losing. Still, his pride roared louder than reason. "You don't scare me," he repeated again, though this time softer, like he was trying to convince himself. Keanu nodded slowly. "Then why are you shaking?" The words weren't meant to humiliate. They were meant to hold up a mirror. And they did. Trent looked down and saw his own hands trembling. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Then, from the back of the crowd, the distant sound of sirens began to wail. Not chaotic, controlled, but unmistakable. 2 patrol cars rounded the park's entrance. Trent froze. Colby took a step back. Keanu didn't move. The lead patrol car screeched to a stop just outside the sidewalk, and the door opened. A tall man in a pressed uniform stepped out, salt and pepper hair, a badge with more years behind it than either Trent or Colby had in service. Lieutenant Jaime Mendez. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. He simply looked at the crowd, looked at the 2 officers, then, finally, at Keanu, standing beside a bruised elderly woman with her dead husband's photo clutched in her lap. "What the hell is going on here?" Mendez asked. The entire park went silent. Keanu didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, gesturing to Rosalía. And in that moment, with the whole city watching, the truth began to surface. The sirens cut through the tension like a blade. The crowd parted just enough to make way for the LAPD cruiser that pulled up against the curb, its lights still flashing. Doors opened. Out stepped Lieutenant Jaime Mendez. He was in his early 50s, but years in the force had carved lines deeper than his age should have allowed. His short black hair was flecked with gray. His shoulders were squared, his eyes sharp and searching. He had the look of a man who had seen too much and still wasn't used to seeing it. His eyes scanned the scene quickly. A crowd, cameras, a bruised woman sitting on a bench, trembling. Officers Trent and Colby standing stiff like they were still trying to remember how to breathe. And in the center of it all, Keanu Reeves. For a moment, Mendez blinked in disbelief. He knew who Keanu was, of course. Everyone did. But he'd never seen that name associated with chaos. Never in the center of controversy. Never like this. He stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "What happened here?" Trent took a quick step forward. "Lieutenant, thank God. We were in the process of detaining a possible suspect when this man began interfering with our work and inciting the crowd." Colby nodded, though his lips stayed shut. He looked pale. Mendez didn't respond immediately. His eyes shifted to Rosalía. Her knees were bloodied. Her wrist bore the marks of tightly clamped handcuffs. Her cardigan was torn, and her face was locked in that stunned, frozen expression he'd seen on too many victims who didn't know if they were safe yet. He looked back to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves," he said carefully. "Is that accurate?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He turned and looked at Rosalía, still seated, clutching the folded photograph to her chest. Then he looked back to Mendez. She was sitting on a park bench, Keanu said, voice calm. They approached her aggressively. No cause, no warning. They threw her to the ground. They handcuffed her. She was bleeding. I stepped in when no one else did. Mendez's gaze didn't waver. You interfered with their arrest? I prevented an abuse of power, Keanu replied. One of the teenagers in the crowd called out, "We have it on video." Mendez turned. "You filmed the whole thing?" A girl in a blue denim jacket stepped forward with her phone still recording. "From the beginning," she said. "You can watch it right now." Keanu stepped back to give them space. Mendez gestured to the girl. "Please, let me see it." She held up her phone and hit play. Mendez leaned in. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen as the audio played clearly. Rosalía's cries, the shouts of the officers, the thud of her body hitting the ground. After 1 minute, Mendez looked up. His face had changed. The weight of what he'd just seen settled heavy in his chest. Lieutenant Mendez turned the phone toward Officer Trent. "You said she was resisting." Trent shifted uncomfortably. "She wasn't cooperating. She wouldn't give us her ID. She didn't have time to," the girl with the phone said. "You pulled her off the bench before she could even stand up." Mendez looked back at the screen. He rewound it, played it again, slower. This time focusing on Rosalía's body as she was yanked upward, her knees buckling, her arm twisting behind her back at an unnatural angle. The gasps in the crowd were clear, along with the unmistakable sound of impact when she hit the pavement. Colby's voice on the recording came next. "How much dope you sell today, huh?" The lieutenant's jaw clenched. Trent tried to recover. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, this video doesn't show the whole situation. We had a description. She matched it. We acted in the interest of safety." "What description?" Mendez asked, still staring at the screen. Trent hesitated. "Elderly woman, Hispanic, possibly dealing drugs. That's what," dispatch said. Mendez turned to face him fully now. "So you walked into a public park and decided this woman sitting alone on a bench was your suspect? Without question? Without a word?" Colby finally spoke, quietly. She looked nervous, like she was hiding something. "She's 76, Keanu said from behind them. She was holding a photo of her husband. Rosalía lifted the photo now with trembling fingers, showing it to Mendez. The lieutenant looked at it, then at her. His voice dropped. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Rosalía Ortega," she whispered. He took a slow breath. "Do you have any drugs on you?" She shook her head. "Number, I only had birdseed in my bag." "And a sandwich." Mendez turned back to the officers. "Did you search her bag?" Trent nodded. "Yes." "Did you find anything illegal?" Number, the lieutenant's eyes hardened. "Did she resist arrest?" "She didn't comply." "That's not what I asked," Mendez snapped. "Did she resist?" Trent went silent. Mendez stepped back, looking at both of them as if seeing them for the first time. Then he turned to Keanu. "I saw what I needed to see," he said. "Thank you for stepping in." Keanu didn't respond, only gave a small nod. The lieutenant turned back to Rosalía, his tone softer now. "Ma'am, do you need medical attention?" She nodded slowly. "My shoulder, my knees." Mendez lifted his radio and called for paramedics. Then he turned to Trent and Colby, his tone sharpening again. "Unacceptable," he said. "Absolutely unacceptable." Trent tried again. "Sir, we thought. You didn't think." "That's the problem." Mendez's voice grew colder. "You acted on instinct and prejudice. You escalated a peaceful situation into a public assault. And now, half the city has it on video." Colby swallowed hard. Then Mendez issued his first direct order. "Uncuff her. Now." Colby hesitated, hand twitching, near his belt as if expecting Mendez to change his mind. But the silence from the crowd was deafening now. Dozens of phones still pointed their way. The air had shifted. There was no room for defiance. "Do it," Mendez repeated. Colby knelt beside Rosalía and fumbled with the handcuffs. His hands were visibly shaking. The metallic click as the cuffs released echoed louder than any siren. Rosalía winced and clutched her wrist, red and bruised. Keanu stepped forward instinctively, offering his arm as support. She accepted it without a word. eyes shimmering with pain and pride. Paramedics were already jogging across the lawn toward them. Mendez moved aside so they could work, but his eyes never left his officers. "I want your body cam footage, both of you," Mendez said. "Now." Trent mumbled something and tapped his chest rig. "Battery died." "Mine too," Colby added quickly. Mendez exhaled sharply. "Of course it did." He turned to the crowd. "Anyone else recording? I'd appreciate if you send the footage to Internal Affairs. We'll be launching a formal investigation into this incident." Phones lit up with nods of approval. A few in the crowd clapped. Someone shouted, "About time!" Keanu helped Rosalía to her feet slowly. The paramedics took over, easing her onto a gurney as they examined her shoulder and checked her pulse. She kept clutching the photo of her husband in her lap, refusing to let it go. "Do you want to press charges?" one paramedic asked gently. Rosalía looked at Keanu, then at Mendez. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Yes, I do," Mendez nodded. "We'll take your statement once you're stable, ma'am. And I'm personally making sure this doesn't get swept under anything." Then he looked at Keanu again, this time with something like gratitude and shame blended together. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Keanu shook his head. "It's not about me. She was sitting and met her. A park. That shouldn't be a crime." Mendez turned back toward his patrol car, but not before addressing his officers one last time. "You're both suspended, effective immediately," he said. "Turn in your weapons and badges by the end of the day. Internal Affairs will follow up." Colby's face went pale. Trent didn't say a word. As they stood there stunned, the crowd began to part for the gurney as the paramedics wheeled Rosalía toward the ambulance. Keanu walked alongside her. Not as a hero, just a man who happened to be there when the world tilted too far in the wrong direction. He looked out over the park, now filled with murmurs, phones lowered, tension bleeding into reflection. The moment had passed, but the message had not. Sometimes, all it took was one person refusing to look away, and the ripple had only just begun. The weight of everything that had just happened settled into the stillness of the park like a dense fog. As soon as the cuffs were off and the paramedics stepped in, Rosalía's body, already battered from the takedown and drained by the emotional storm, began to tremble uncontrollably. Her lips parted, but no words came. She tried to steady herself on the gurney, gripping the fabric with fingers that had once sewn thousands of garments to support her children. But now, they were shaking so hard she could barely hold the photo of her husband. Keanu stood beside her, gently placing a steadying hand on her back. His eyes scanned her face, reading the signs: pallor, rapid breathing, unfocused gaze. Something wasn't right. She was losing her footing in more ways than one. Then, without warning, Rosalía's eyes rolled back. Her body gave out. "Whoa, she's going down!" one of the paramedics shouted. But Keanu was already there. He caught her before her head could hit the pavement, cradling her in his arms as gently as if she were made of glass. The gurney rolled forward just in time. Together with the paramedics, Keanu helped lay her down carefully. "She's in shock," one medic muttered, checking her vitals. Blood pressures crashing. A small gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones were still out, but now they lowered. Faces turned from eager spectators to worried citizens. Rosalía was no longer just a symbol. She was a human being fighting to stay conscious after an act of unjust violence. "Stay with us," another paramedic said softly, adjusting her oxygen mask. "You're safe now." Keanu backed up slowly, giving them space to work, but his eyes never left Rosalía, not for a second. And then came the noise: engines, doors slamming, voices barking into phones. The media had arrived. At first, it was just a lone blogger with a camera and press badge dangling from his hoodie. Then, a news van rolled up, its logo unmistakable. Then, two more. Reporters jogged toward the scene, mics already extended, cameramen in tow. "Mr. Reeves, can you confirm what happened here today? Were you assaulted? Was the woman in custody unlawfully detained? Did the LAPD use excessive force in your opinion?" The questions flew, one after another, but Keanu didn't answer any of them. His focus never shifted. He moved to the side of the gurney again, where Rosalía lay breathing shallowly, her fingers twitching as if searching for something familiar in all the noise. Keanu reached down and took her hand. She squeezed back weakly. One of the reporters moved in closer, but Keanu finally spoke not to them, but to the medics. "Is she stable enough to be transported?" "She will be. Just need a few more minutes," one of them replied. Keanu nodded. "Let me ride with her." The paramedics exchanged glances. One of them recognized him now not as a celebrity, but as the man who had kept a crisis from becoming a tragedy. "We'll make it happen," they said. The ambulance doors swung open, and the stretcher locked into place with a soft click. As the paramedics lifted Rosalía into the back, Keanu stepped up behind them, ducking his head to enter. He didn't hesitate, didn't look back at the chaos blooming around the scene, just climbed into the ambulance and sat beside her, holding her hand gently in both of his. Rosalía stirred, her eyelids fluttered, and then her lips parted just enough to form a faint whisper through the oxygen mask. "Thank you, mijo." The word mijo, my son, hit Keanu like a wave. Not because it was literal, but because it came from a place of raw, instinctive affection. It wasn't about who he was to the world. It was about who he had been to her in that moment. Protector, witness, kindness in the middle of cruelty. He leaned in just slightly and nodded. "You're safe now." Outside the ambulance, things were spiraling. Reporters tried to shout questions through the crack in the doors before they slammed shut. One cameraman banged on the side. Another tried to shove a mic through the window. Inside, none of that mattered. The paramedic pressed a button, and the siren roared to life. Red and white lights pulsed across the grass and up the trunks of nearby trees. And just like that, they were gone, speeding down the road toward County General. Back in the park, Lieutenant Mendez stayed behind. He was trying to de-escalate what had now become a spectacle. "We need to clear this area. It's still an active investigation," he told the media, raising his voice above the growing crowd. "And anyone who witnessed what happened, I need your statements." Phones went back up. No one moved. Someone shouted, "We saw it all. He didn't touch them. They threw her like she was nothing." Another voice followed. "She was just sitting on the bench, that's all." Lieutenant Mendez turned to Officer Colby and Officer Dana, his face unreadable but stern. "I want your full reports on my desk before midnight," he said flatly. "And remember, you're under body cam review." Officer Colby, now visibly sweating, nodded stiffly. Dana looked down, her jaw locked tight. Meanwhile, just beyond the perimeter, something else was happening. A woman in a blue windbreaker was live streaming to her followers, her voice trembling with righteous fury. This is what happens in broad daylight. An elderly woman, a war vet's widow, thrown to the ground like a criminal. A man next to her added, "And if it wasn't for Keanu Reeves, who knows what they would have done next." The story was no longer just local. It was spreading, trending. The name Rosalía Marine was already climbing the charts on social media platforms, alongside hashtags like #Justice for Rosalía and #Keanu Protects. What had begun as a routine morning in the park was now becoming something much bigger. But for Keanu, none of that mattered yet. His eyes stayed on the woman whose hand he held, and whose dignity, even amid all this madness, still radiated like sunlight breaking through a storm. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights felt cold, but Rosalía's fingers stayed wrapped around Keanu's like a lifeline. Nurses moved briskly around her, taking vitals, running tests, stitching the cut near her temple. Through it all, she kept her eyes on Keanu, not out of fear, but grounding. One nurse whispered, "Is that who I think it is?" Another replied, "He came with her, didn't leave her side." When they gently lifted Rosalía to wheel her in for a scan, she winced. Keanu stepped back, giving space, but his expression didn't waver. No cameras, no handlers, no spectacle. Just a man honoring a stranger who deserved dignity. In the hallway, a doctor approached him. "She'll be okay. Dehydrated, minor concussion, likely stress-induced fainting. She's a tough one." Keanu gave a soft nod of gratitude. Then came the questions. 2 internal affairs officers had been dispatched. They arrived quietly but with purpose, wanting to know what he saw, what he did, how it escalated. Keanu answered without drama, just facts, measured tone, clear eyes. She was alone, sitting quietly. They didn't ask questions. They restrained her. Did she resist? She barely had time to speak. And then came the question Keanu had anticipated. Why did you get involved? He paused, then answered simply, because no one else did. That answer, later repeated in thousands of headlines, was not delivered for effect. It was the truth. Because he didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who refused to stay seated. Back at the park, the ripple effect was already underway. Lieutenant Mendez had put the officers on administrative leave pending investigation. The department issued a statement calling it a deeply troubling incident, but public pressure was building faster than the official responses. Within hours, Keanu's quiet act of protection became national news. Not because he gave an interview, he declined them all, but because witnesses had filmed everything. Clips of him shielding Rosalía, holding up his hand, stepping between her and the officers. It was all online. But even as the media storm grew, Keanu didn't return home. He stayed at the hospital. He sat in the corner of Rosalía's room as she rested, the soft beep of heart monitors filling the silence. When she finally opened her eyes again, hours later, her voice was hoarse. You didn't have to stay. I know, he said gently, but I wanted to. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. You remind me of my son, she whispered. He died in Iraq, long time ago. You have his eyes, his quiet. Keanu blinked back, the emotion rising in his throat. He reached for a tissue, gently handed it to her, and simply said, I'm honored. She closed her eyes again, not to sleep, but to feel peace. Outside the hospital, a crowd had gathered. Not paparazzi, but people. Silent, respectful, holding candles. Some brought flowers. Others held signs that read, We see you, Rosalía, and kindness is strength. And somewhere in that stillness, Keanu knew this wasn't just about one moment in a park. It was the beginning of something bigger. The first video hit Twitter just after midnight. A shaky clip, 30 seconds long, showing Keanu Reeves stepping between two officers and an elderly woman, hand raised in calm defiance. The caption read, Keanu Reeves just stopped LAPD from hurting this woman. No joke. Number Justice for Rosalía. By morning, it had over 12 million views. More videos surfaced, different angles, different voices. One caught the moment Officer Trent reached for his taser, another captured the trembling in Rosalía's hands as she sat handcuffed on the ground. And at the center of it all, Keanu. Quiet, but immovable. The hashtags exploded. Number Justice for Rosalía. Number Keanu stands up. Number Protect our elders. Number No excuse. Celebrities began to repost the footage. Ava DuVernay tweeted, This isn't just about an old woman in a park, it's about all of us. Viola Davis shared a still image of Keanu shielding Rosalía with the caption, Protecting the vulnerable isn't heroic, it's human. Even politicians joined in, some praising his courage, others scrambling to issue statements about policing reform. What struck people most was not the confrontation, it was how calmly Keanu handled it. No shouting, no pushing, just presence. A presence that turned into momentum. By the afternoon, news anchors were analyzing the body language frame by frame. Social justice leaders held live panels discussing ageism, racism, and the pattern of excessive force. Civil rights organizations issued calls for investigations. Petitions circulated with lightning speed, demanding accountability for officers Trent and Colby. And yet, Keanu stayed silent until he didn't. That evening, he released a short written statement on his official social platforms. No press conference, no video, just a single post with white text on a black background. It read, No badge should protect cruelty. We must protect each other. This is not about me. It's about Rosalía. It's about everyone who's been silenced, bruised, or ignored. We cannot stay quiet anymore. The statement was signed simply Keanu. The post was shared over 20 million times in 24 hours. Rosalía, still recovering in her hospital room, watched the response unfold through her nurse's phone. Her eyes welled up as she saw strangers chanting her name. People of every background, every age, calling for change not with violence, but with unity. And then came the photo. Taken quietly by a nurse, it showed Rosalía in her hospital bed, smiling faintly, her hand clasped in Keanu's. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her, his expression gentle, protective. That photo went viral instantly. CNN called it the image of the moment. Time magazine used it on their homepage with the headline, "A quiet stand becomes a movement." The New York Times ran it with the subheading, "When kindness goes viral." But for Rosalía, it wasn't about headlines. It was about hope. As the photo continued to circle the globe, deeper truths began to surface. It started with a blog post from a former LAPD officer, anonymously submitted. The post described a troubling culture of unchecked aggression inside the department. Officers like Trent and Colby were always protected, it read. They treated people like problems to be eliminated. I left because I couldn't watch it anymore. The blog went viral. Then came the testimonies. Not from celebrities, not from activists, but from ordinary people. A janitor named Harold Rivera shared a story about Officer Colby throwing his lunch on the ground during a mistaken identity stop. A single mother named Tasha Williams posted about how Officer Trent dragged her teenage son off his bike 3 years ago, accusing him of loitering in front of their own apartment building. One after another, people spoke up. Church leaders, street vendors, teachers, elders, men and women who had stayed silent out of fear. Now, emboldened by the public's reaction, they began to tell the truth. Local radio stations opened their lines for live calls. Stories poured in, many ending in tears. Each one added a piece to the puzzle, proof that what happened to Rosalía wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, a painful one. Soon, local newspapers dug into Trent and Colby's personnel files. Leaks revealed over a dozen complaints filed between them in the last 5 years. Most had been quietly dismissed. A few were still under internal review. The department said nothing at first, but pressure mounted quickly. Keanu didn't address the details, but his silence made noise. He kept visiting Rosalía, kept listening to those affected, kept refusing interviews. Instead, he worked behind the scenes. He contacted the ACLU and several Latino civil rights groups. He offered to fund legal aid for victims of police misconduct. He paid for a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times, not with hhis face, but with Rosalía's quote in bold, "I'm old, but I'm not invisible." The ad ended with a simple sentence, "We see you. We stand with you." And people did. Rallies were organized in front of City Hall. Not angry riots, peaceful gatherings, candlelight vigils, song circles, story hours. Across the country, groups used the hashtag number #RosaliasBench to organize sit-ins at public parks, symbolizing the right to rest, exist, and be seen without suspicion. Rosalía's story had become everyone's story, a movement born from stillness, from a bench, from a woman who just wanted to remember her husband in peace, and from a man who refused to look away. The final wave of impact came not from celebrities or journalists, but from a child. Her name was Sofía Morales. She was 11 years old and lived just a few blocks from the park. Her father had taken her there that same morning, right before the incident began. She had watched it all, silently holding her dad's hand as Keanu stood between the officers and Rosalía. Sofía drew a picture that evening. It showed a brown bench, a silver-haired woman with tears in her eyes, and a tall man with his arms stretched wide like wings. Behind them, 2 towering shadows loomed in blue, and in the sky above, a ribbon of sunlight cut through gray clouds. She called it Protector. Her father posted the drawing online with the caption, "My daughter wanted to show what real courage looks like. She says Mr. Keanu is a hero." I agree. The image was shared over 1 million times in 2 days. Rosalía saw it from her hospital bed. She cried when the nurse read Sofía's caption aloud. She asked for a copy to be framed and placed beside her husband's photo on the table. Keanu visited that evening. When he walked in, she was asleep. He sat beside her, quietly, for nearly an hour. Before he left, he reached into his coat and placed a small object next to her hand. It was a folded paper crane, simple, white, delicate. He had made it himself. On its wing, he had written just 4 words: "We see you, Rosalía." That quiet act became yet another symbol. The media ran out of words. Opinion columns tried to frame Keanu as a vigilante, a rebel, or a political figure. But none of those labels stuck. He never gave a follow-up interview. Never corrected or confirmed anyone's assumptions. He didn't need to. The message was already out there, spoken in actions, in silence, in kindness. What started as a humiliating scene for one woman had turned into a nationwide examination of dignity, power, and justice. The officers were officially suspended pending investigation. Lawsuits were filed. New department protocols were drafted within weeks. But more importantly, something deeper had shifted. People began to notice again. The elderly woman walking alone. The security guard sitting quietly on the steps. The man in the coffee shop staring at an old photo. They weren't invisible anymore. Because one man stood up, others followed. Not with force, not with anger, but with truth. And that was the power of one quiet moment in a noisy world. 3 days after the incident in the park, Lieutenant Jaime Mendez sat alone in his precinct office, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him. The air was thick with tension. On his desk were 2 thick folders, each filled with citizen complaints. Both were stamped with the names of Officers Trent and Colby. Some of the reports dated back years. A bruised elbow here, a twisted wrist there, a stolen phone never recovered, resisted arrest written in large red letters at the top of incident summaries. But what Mendez saw most, what made his stomach turn, was a pattern hiding in plain sight. Nearly all of the victims were elderly. Nearly all were people of color. Some of the complaints had been quietly dismissed by past supervisors. Others were never properly followed up. A few had mysteriously disappeared from digital archives. But now, in the glare of public scrutiny, they couldn't be ignored. Not anymore. Mendez picked up the phone and called Internal Affairs. By the end of the day, a formal investigation was launched into both officers. The department tried to keep things quiet. They said it was standard procedure. But the truth had already leaked. A community-led watchdog group posted screenshots of old reports, the ones that never made it past internal filing cabinets. A few brave retirees stepped forward and shared their stories on live television. One woman from Echo Park, aged 72, said Trent once shoved her against a brick wall because she asked too many questions. Another man, a Korean War veteran, recalled being handcuffed for loitering while waiting outside his doctor's office. It all painted a picture that couldn't be denied. Rosalía's case wasn't a rare exception. It was a window into something much bigger. While this unfolded, Keanu remained silent. He declined interviews, politely turned down invitations to speak at press, conferences, or rallies. He wasn't hiding. He simply didn't want to become the center of something that wasn't supposed to be about him. But when Internal Affairs called and asked if he'd be willing to testify if necessary, he answered with one word: yes. That was all. No drama, no headlines. Just the same quiet integrity that had defined him from the beginning. As the investigation gained traction, the ripple effects spread far beyond the station walls. Media outlets that had initially rushed to cover the Keanu Reeves incident now dug deeper. They turned their attention to systemic failures, not just individual bad actors. Opinion columns filled with sharp questions. Why had these officers remained on the streets for so long? Who had protected them? And how many more Rosalías were out there? Community forums filled with outrage. But it wasn't just noise, it was movement. A candlelight vigil was held in MacArthur Park, the same park where Rosalía had been thrown to the ground. Hundreds gathered. Some held signs that read "Protect our elders" and "Justice for Rosalía." Others held up phones with the video paused on one haunting frame, Keanu's outstretched hand between the taser and her trembling body. The image had become iconic, but the real story wasn't a frame. It was the people. At a hastily organized town hall meeting, city officials tried to calm the storm. They promised reforms, promised accountability. But it wasn't until Rosalía's granddaughter stepped up to the microphone that the room went truly silent. She was small, barely 20, wearing a simple t-shirt with her abuela's face on it. Her voice shook at first. "My name is Esperanza Alvarez," she said. "I'm here because my grandmother almost died. Not from illness, not from an accident, but from fear, from power that was used without thought, without compassion, without justice." She paused, eyes glistening. "If it weren't for him, I could be planning a funeral." A few gasps filled the room. One woman sobbed quietly in the back. Esperanza didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were precise, wounded, powerful. "She goes to that park every Sunday. She feeds pigeons, reads the Bible, talks to children like they're her own, and she got thrown to the ground like garbage." Then came the moment that no one expected. She held up her phone, screen turned to the crowd. This is the man who stopped it, and he didn't do it with force. He didn't threaten anyone. He just stood there. A photo filled the screen. Keanu, kneeling beside Rosalía, cradling her shoulders. Not staged, not posed, just human. "My grandma says God sent him." The room erupted in applause, not for celebrity, but for courage. Back in his apartment that night, Keanu sat alone. He didn't watch the broadcast live, but someone sent him the clip. He played it once, then again, and again. The final time, he simply stared at Esperanza's face. He thought about how close it had been, how 1 second, 1 breath, 1 mistake could have changed everything. Not just for Rosalía, but for the community, the children, the quiet elders who now feared the very people sworn to protect them. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a witness, and witnesses have responsibilities. That night, Keanu opened a notepad on his desk and started writing something. It wasn't for social media. It wasn't for a press release. It was a letter to Rosalía. He wasn't sure if he'd ever send it, but the words needed somewhere to go. Rosalía never knew about the letter, but a week later, a nurse brought Keanu a small envelope at the hospital. Inside was a hand-drawn card, crayon flowers, shaky handwriting. It was from the children at the community center Rosalía had volunteered at for years. "Thank you for saving our abuela," it read. One of them had signed it, Milo, age 6. Keanu smiled faintly. Then he looked up at the news playing on the hospital room's television. Officer Colby had been suspended without pay. Officer Trent was under formal investigation. Lieutenant Mendez was speaking to the press, reaffirming his commitment to truth. But Keanu didn't care about the headlines. He cared that Rosalía was alive. He cared that little Milo still had his favorite storyteller. And as he folded the card and tucked it into his coat pocket, Keanu knew one thing with quiet certainty. This was just the beginning. The council chamber was packed beyond capacity. A line stretched out the door and down the marble steps of City Hall. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, tension, and whispered opinions. Cameras from every local news station were trained on the podium, and city officials looked more uncomfortable than usual in their chairs. Keanu sat near the back of the room, dressed simply in a black shirt and blazer. No sunglasses, no security detail. Just him, tucked into the shadows, unnoticed by most. He hadn't come to be seen. He had come to listen. Councilwoman Janet Park banged the gavel 3 times. "The special session of the Los Angeles City Council is now in order. We are here to address the incident that occurred last week in Griffith Park, involving 2 officers and a civilian. We invite community members to speak in order." Rosalía's name was called first. There was a long silence before she rose from her seat. Her body was still recovering. She leaned on a cane with one hand and held her granddaughter's arm with the other. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the microphone. The room fell silent. "I was just going for a walk," she began, her voice hoarse but steady. "I saw something that didn't look right. I said something. Then, I was treated like a criminal." A wave of murmurs rippled through the chamber. "I was slammed to the ground. I'm 73 years old. I've lived here for 40 years. I pay my taxes. I raise my grandkids. And I volunteer 3 days a week to feed the homeless in Echo Park." She paused to breathe. Cameras zoomed in. Those officers didn't ask me a single question. They didn't listen. But one man did. She turned slightly and gestured toward the back. I didn't know him, but he stood up for me. He risked himself, and because of him, I'm standing here today, alive. Keanu shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't want this to be about him. Rosalia's eyes filled with tears. You need to fix this. Not just for me. For the next old woman who walks down the street. For the next voice that tries to speak and gets silenced. As she returned to her seat, the chamber erupted into applause. Even some of the council members clapped, unsure whether they were responding to her strength or the public pressure gathering like a storm. Councilwoman Park tapped the mic again. We appreciate your words, ma'am. Now we'll hear from Lieutenant Jaime Mendez of the LAPD. Lieutenant Jaime Mendez stepped up to the microphone. His uniform was crisp, his expression firm but respectful. He looked out over the chamber, took a slow breath, and began. I've served with the LAPD for 29 years. I've seen the good, the bad, and everything in between. What happened in Griffith Park was not policing, it was abuse. His words stunned the room into silence. I arrived on the scene after the altercation. What I saw was a woman in medical distress, crying on the ground, handcuffed. I saw 2 officers scrambling to explain themselves, and I saw Mr. Keanu Reeves trying to de-escalate the situation not with force, but with calm, with truth. He glanced briefly toward the back of the room, where Keanu sat still, his eyes lowered. I reviewed the footage that bystanders took. I reviewed our own patrol vehicle cams, and I submitted a report. Officers Trent and Colby did not follow protocol. They ignored departmental procedures on how to engage with civilians, especially the elderly. Worse, their reports later included false statements. A few gasps echoed. A couple of council members exchanged uneasy glances. Mr. Reeves didn't intervene because he's famous. He intervened because no one else was stepping up. And he did it without raising his voice, without aggression. He de-escalated what could have ended much worse. Councilman Ronald Becker raised his hand, interrupting. Lieutenant, are you saying that a civilian did your job better than trained officers? Mendez met his eyes. No, Councilman. I'm saying a decent human being did what was morally right when others failed to do their duty. That earned a round of applause, louder this time. Councilman Becker's face reddened. Councilwoman Carla DuPont, sitting to the left, leaned toward her mic. Lieutenant, are you recommending disciplinary action? Yes, Internal Affairs is investigating. Based on the evidence, I would recommend suspension without pay for both officers, pending a formal hearing and additional review of prior complaints filed against them. The room buzzed again. Reporters were furiously typing on their laptops. The moment felt bigger than anyone had expected. Another councilman cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. And what about legal exposure, Lieutenant? If we discipline these officers now, before a formal hearing, the city could be sued. A different voice, deeper and calm, cut through the noise. Then maybe the city needs to be sued. Heads turned as Keanu Reeves stood from the back row. He didn't walk to the mic right away. He waited, measured the room, then walked slowly, deliberately, up the center aisle. No one stopped him. Not one person moved. He stood at the podium, took a brief breath, and looked each council member in the eye. I wasn't planning to speak today, he began. But if justice requires silence, then it's no justice at all. The room went completely still. I didn't film that moment for the world to see. Others did. I didn't speak out for attention. I spoke because someone was bleeding while everyone else looked away. He placed his palms on the edge of the podium. And if the only thing stopping you from doing the right thing is fear of a lawsuit, then you're not protecting the people. You're protecting yourselves. Keanu paused. No script, no fanfare, just truth. There are cameras everywhere now, but justice doesn't come from the lens. It comes from the heart. He stepped back from the mic, eyes steady, voice quiet. A moment of silence followed. Then, like a ripple breaking the surface, one woman in the audience stood and clapped. Another followed, and another. Within seconds, the entire chamber was on its feet. Rosalía, seated near the front with her granddaughter, wiped tears from her eyes. She whispered, "Mijo, you gave us a voice." And for once, even the council had no words. The atmosphere inside the LAPD's Internal Affairs conference room was unusually tense. Officers Trent and Colby sat stiffly in their chairs, their uniforms crisp but their faces tight. Across from them sat a panel of senior officials, including Lieutenant Jamie Mendez, who now carried the quiet weight of everything that had unfolded. The verdict was coming, and the air felt electric. The hearing had lasted for hours. Footage had been reviewed. Witnesses had spoken. Even Rosalía's granddaughter had delivered a short but piercing statement that left the room cold and still. The bystanders' video, once grainy and chaotic, was now crystal clear evidence, displayed on a large screen, showing every movement, every shout, every moment the officers could not explain away. Trent tried to shift the blame, insisting that Rosalía had been resisting. Colby mumbled something about standard procedure. But those phrases fell flat in a room where the truth had already spoken louder than any justification could. Then came the decision, effective immediately. The lead investigator said, voice steady, "Officers Trent and Colby are suspended without pay pending formal dismissal. Your actions were found to be in violation of department policy and the public trust." Trent's jaw clenched. Colby stared at the table. No applause, no gasps, just silence. The kind that comes when justice, slow and steady, finally arrives. Outside the building, reporters were already waiting, and whispers of further action had begun to swirl. The district attorney's office had quietly launched a preliminary inquiry into criminal charges, specifically excessive use of force and civil rights violations. And for once, the story wasn't buried. By the next morning, headlines had already exploded across the internet. Trent and Colby dismissed DA, investigates civil rights violations. Keanu Reeves incident sparks. Justice reform hearings. Justice for Rosalía. Elderly abuse by cops triggers national outrage. The footage had done more than prove misconduct, it had ignited a movement. Civil rights attorneys, including some from national watchdog groups, were now involved. Petitions gained hundreds of thousands of signatures overnight. And then came the formal press conference from the Los Angeles County District Attorney. Standing before a sea of cameras, DA Marissa Kwan spoke firmly. Based on preliminary findings, our office has opened an official criminal investigation into the actions of former officers Trent and Colby during the incident involving Ms. Rosalía Martinez. We are reviewing evidence under federal and state civil rights statutes, as well as potential charges for assault under color of authority. When asked if Keanu Reeves would be subpoenaed, she replied, "We don't believe that will be necessary. Mr. Reeves has already provided a written affidavit and the footage speaks for itself." At that same moment, Colby was attempting damage control. He'd agreed to a radio interview with a local conservative host, claiming he and Trent were being thrown under the bus to satisfy a woke mob. He blamed Hollywood elites for turning what he called a routine stop into a circus. But within hours, his words backfired. The clip of his interview circulated rapidly, especially the part where he said, "We were just doing our jobs. People don't understand how hard it is dealing with crazies in the park." That single sentence sealed their public image. Then came the irony. A second video surfaced, this one from inside the precinct, days before the incident. It was body cam footage inadvertently left rolling. In the clip, Trent and Colby could be heard joking crudely about cleaning up the homeless problem and teaching these old-timers some respect. But it was one sentence in particular that caught fire. "All this over some old woman," Trent muttered on a hot mic while being escorted out of his disciplinary hearing. That clip went viral within minutes. The lack of remorse, the contempt, the dehumanization. For many, that was the tipping point. Keanu remained silent publicly, but Rosalía's family released a short statement. Her granddaughter wrote, "She is recovering slowly. Thank you to everyone who saw her as a human being when others did not." In the meantime, the city council called for a formal vote on police oversight reforms. The officers' unions tried to rally support, but even some of their own members began distancing themselves. A retired sergeant posted, "When you break trust that deeply and that publicly, no one can cover for you. Not even your badge." What remained was a shattered illusion and the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. As the public backlash intensified, Trent and Colby were officially charged with assault, under color of authority, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. The arraignment was quiet, with no cameras allowed in the courtroom, but outside, a silent crowd held candles and handmade signs with Rosalia's name. Inside his modest apartment, Keanu watched the news without celebration. He wasn't interested in revenge. Justice, to him, was never about spectacle. It was about acknowledgement, about accountability, about making sure Rosalía and those like her were no longer invisible. One particular clip stood out to him. A local journalist had interviewed a street vendor who often saw Rosalía in the park. "She always brought bread," the man said in Spanish. "Even when she had little, she gave. I saw those officers ignore her kindness week after week. But I also saw the man who stood up for her when no one else did." That statement lingered with Keanu. Later that week, a city muralist painted a tribute on the side of a downtown building. It showed Rosalía seated with her walker, one hand raised in defiance, the other holding Keanu's. Above it were the words, "Dignity is not optional." The public mood had shifted. The city was no longer silent. Justice had begun, not just for Rosalía, but for countless others who'd been overlooked. And Keanu, though weary, knew his presence had mattered, not as a movie star, not as a hero, but as a man who simply refused to look away. The air outside City Hall was crisp, tinged with the warmth of early spring sunlight. A gentle breeze fluttered the banners hanging from the old stone columns, each bearing Rosalía's name in bold letters framed by images of peace lilies and olive branches. A podium had been set up on the steps, and a crowd had gathered students, elders, activists, police officers, reporters, and everyday citizens, drawn together by a story that had pierced through politics, divisions, and headlines. Inside, Rosalía stood quietly in the wings, dressed in a deep navy blue dress, with a white shawl wrapped gently over her shoulders. Her granddaughter smoothed her hair and whispered encouragement. The honor being bestowed upon her wasn't just symbolic, it was deeply personal. For decades, she had swept curbs, cleaned homes, and picked up discarded cans in that park. She had walked with dignity, even as the world around her barely noticed. Now, they were noticing. Mayor Lindsay took the stage first, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we recognize not just a survivor, but a woman who became the conscience of our city." Rosalía Santiago reminded us all that silence enables cruelty. Her courage forced us to see and to act. When Keanu arrived, he did so without fanfare. He wore a simple charcoal suit, no tie, his hair tucked behind his ears. He kept his sunglasses on until he took a quiet seat in the back row. He had already made it clear to the organizers. He would only attend the ceremony if Rosalía spoke first, and if no attempt was made to reframe the narrative around him. This was her moment. Rosalía slowly made her way to the microphone with the help of her walker. A hush fell over the plaza. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with every word. "They said I was just an old woman in the way," she began, glancing down briefly at her speech. "But I was never in the way. I was walking where I've always walked, in the park I've always loved. What happened to me was wrong, but what happened next was right. Someone saw me. Someone spoke up. And because of that, today, I'm not invisible anymore." Tears glistened in more eyes than she could count. She paused and looked out into the crowd, then directly toward Keanu. "To the man who stood between me and injustice, you didn't make it about yourself, and I thank you for that." The applause that followed Rosalía's speech wasn't just polite. It was thunderous, sustained, and emotional. People rose to their feet not just for her words, but for what she symbolized. She had endured pain and humiliation, but stood here now, dignified and unbroken, a mirror to a city waking up to its own reflection. After Rosalía returned to her seat, a slight nod from her to the mayor signaled that it was time for Keanu to speak. He hesitated before rising. taking a moment to collect himself. Every camera in the plaza turned to track his steps as he approached the podium, but Keanu didn't look at them. His eyes were focused on Rosalía. He adjusted the microphone gently. "This isn't my story," he began. "It never was. And I didn't come here to make it about me." A pause, firm and grounded. "I came here because when I saw what was happening in that park, I couldn't walk away. Not because I'm brave, or special, or important, but because cruelty, when left unchecked, becomes normal. And I think we've had enough of that." The crowd quieted again, some nodding, others wiping away quiet tears. "We all watched something terrible unfold," he continued. "And then we watched something powerful rise from it. Rosalía's voice, her courage, her truth. I want you to remember that this woman didn't just survive. She changed something. She shifted the direction of our collective attention, from indifference to action." He looked out over the city square, taking in the faces, some skeptical, some awed, most deeply moved. "If justice requires silence," Keanu said, repeating the words from the council hearing, "then it's no justice at all. And if our laws protect the powerful more than the vulnerable, then it's time to change the laws." A young man standing near the edge of the crowd whispered, "He's right." And soon others echoed the same sentiment. The ripple became a wave. Keanu stepped back from the microphone and gave a slight bow, not to the cameras, not to the officials, but toward Rosalía. And then, without waiting for another round of applause, he returned to his seat in the back row. But the crowd wouldn't let the moment go. They stood again. Some clapped, others simply raised their hands to their hearts. It wasn't performative, it was communal. A shared acknowledgement that they'd all just witnessed something rare, something sincere, in a world that had grown weary of spectacle. Later that afternoon, the mural was unveiled in Crescent Park. It had been painted quietly over the past 2 weeks by a collective of local artists, some of whom had known Rosalía from her decades cleaning trash and picking flowers along the walking path. The mural depicted a moment captured from the footage that had gone viral, but reimagined with vivid colors and symbolism. Keanu was shown kneeling beside Rosalía, one hand extended to shield her, the other gently resting on her shoulder. Her walker, bent from the incident, had been repainted as a symbol of strength. Behind them, rather than police cars, the background showed a sun rising over the park's trees, hope emerging from darkness. Below the mural, carved into the polished stone base, were 5 simple words: "Compassion is strength. Never forget." As the sun dipped behind the mural, painting the plaza in golden light, Rosalía stood quietly before it, tears glistening in her eyes. Keanu joined her, not as a hero, but as a friend. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Around them, children played, elders smiled, and strangers greeted one another with a little more warmth than before. The city had shifted not just in policy, but in spirit. And as people paused before the mural on their way home, they didn't just see 2 figures painted on a wall. They saw a reminder of what courage could become. A quiet breeze moved through the trees of Sunrise Park as city workers carefully unveiled the new mural. Crowds had gathered at the edge of the fence, murmuring in anticipation. Families stood shoulder to shoulder with activists, city employees, and ordinary people who had seen the footage and felt something stir inside them. The buzz wasn't just about Keanu Reeves anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had been broken for too long and was finally being noticed. Rosalía stood near the edge of the unveiling site, her arm lightly resting on her granddaughter's shoulder. She wore a sky blue shawl embroidered with hummingbirds, her favorite design. Her cheeks glowed, not from makeup, but from the quiet pride of knowing she hadn't been silenced. Not this time. Beside her stood Keanu, dressed in jeans and a charcoal blazer. He kept his distance from the microphones and cameras, as always, but his presence carried weight. It reminded everyone that this wasn't a celebrity photo op. It was about a woman who had been hurt and a system that needed to be held accountable. As the canvas dropped, revealing the mural, the crowd went silent. Painted across the brick wall was a vivid image. Rosalía seated on the park bench, tears in her eyes, as two officers towered over her. But in the center, Keanu knelt between them, shielding her with his body. His face was calm but defiant. Her hand clutched his shoulder. And behind them, stylized rays of light, radiated like the sun itself, was bearing witness. The words below the mural were simple. Compassion is strength. The mayor approached the podium, adjusting the mic. Her voice carried through the speakers with clarity and emotion. She spoke of injustice, she spoke of courage, and she invited Rosalía to speak, just as Keanu had requested. Rosalía stepped forward slowly. No teleprompter, no prepared statement, just truth. "I didn't think I'd live to see the day," she began, her voice trembling. "I've lived a long life. I've seen good people fall through cracks. I've seen bad ones thrive in uniforms. And I've seen too many of us get used to it." She paused, and the silence respected her. "But that day in the park, when those men put their hands on me, I thought it would be the end. And then this man, who had no reason to care, who didn't even know my name, stepped in between us and said, 'Enough.'" Her eyes met Keanu's, and something unspoken passed between them. "I thought I was alone," she continued, "but I wasn't. And none of us are not anymore." The crowd erupted in applause, not just for her words, but for what they represented. Keanu didn't speak that day. He didn't need to. His silence was powerful, intentional. His image in the mural, his refusal to make it about himself, his steady hand on Rosalía's shoulder as she returned to her seat. Those actions spoke volumes. But as he stood back and looked at the mural, something inside him shifted. He hadn't come to the park that day seeking attention or to spark change, but he realized something now. Sometimes change doesn't ask for your permission, it just needs your presence. In the days following the mural's unveiling, something began to shift across the city. What had started as a moment one man stepping between a woman and abuse had grown into a movement, and not one driven by outrage alone. It was something softer, deeper, a reckoning wrapped in empathy. The mural sparked dialogue in unexpected places. At barbershops, in churches, during after-school programs and morning radio shows, people asked the same questions. How did it get this far? Why did it take someone like Keanu Reeves to expose what so many had been quietly suffering? At the precinct, changes were underway. Lieutenant Mendez had quietly reassigned certain supervisors, rotating in officers with clean records and reputations for community engagement. A new task force began reviewing all unresolved complaints, especially those involving excessive force toward the elderly or marginalized groups. Internal resistance was fierce, but the public was watching now, and that changed everything. Meanwhile, Rosalía became something of an icon, not that she ever wanted to be. Local schools asked her to speak, advocacy groups sought her wisdom. When she walked through the grocery store, strangers greeted her like an aunt they hadn't seen in years. Her granddaughter joked that she was TikTok famous, though Rosalía didn't even know what that meant. But she smiled anyway. As for Keanu, he tried to return to the quiet life. He declined every major news outlet request. When a national publication offered him the cover story, he turned it down with a short message, "This isn't my story to lead." But he didn't disappear entirely. Quietly, he partnered with local nonprofits, donating resources, offering transportation for elderly residents, even funding training programs for de-escalation and community policing, all anonymously. He asked that his name be left off every flyer, every credit list, every press release. One day, as Rosalía and her granddaughter strolled through the park beneath the mural, they spotted a group of teenagers gathered in front of it. A boy in a hoodie was sketching the image into his notebook. Another girl stood nearby, taking a picture with her phone. "I heard he used to live around here," the boy said. "That actor guy. He still does," someone replied. Rosalía chuckled softly. She didn't interrupt them, didn't correct them, because the truth was, Keanu hadn't left. Not really. He could still be seen now, and then riding his motorcycle past the schoolyard, sitting alone at the park's edge, or browsing at the used bookstore near Main and Howell, but always just out of reach. Not avoiding people, just giving them room to lead. The mural had become more than a tribute. It became a checkpoint, a place where people came to cry, to take selfies, to argue, to reflect. A father once brought his son there after the boy had been bullied at school. A teacher used it to start a lesson on courage. A city councilwoman said it reminded her why she ran for office in the first place. And through it all, no one forgot what sparked it. The image, the footage, and the silent moment when one man chose to kneel instead of turn away. It didn't take long for the storm to come. The mural was barely dry when the headline shifted. What had begun as widespread praise slowly splintered. Major outlets hailed Keanu Reeves as a quiet hero. Talk shows replayed the footage of him shielding Rosalía with solemn admiration. Morning hosts called it the moment America needed. One national newspaper ran the headline, "Compassion is strength, actor sparks cultural shift." But not everyone agreed. On one primetime cable news network, the tone was far less gracious. A host opened his monologue with sarcasm. "So now we're kneeling for suspects and hugging lawbreakers? Is that what we're calling bravery?" Another segment ran under the banner, "Celebrity Chaos, Keanu's Dangerous Message." The panelists debated whether Reeves had undermined law enforcement, emboldened criminals, or staged the whole thing for publicity. One commentator even questioned whether the footage was edited to make officers look worse than they were. Social media exploded. Some users echoed the criticism, using hashtags like #JusticeNotStunts and #SupportTheBlue. But far more rallied behind Keanu. #Compassion is strength trended for 3 straight days. Thousands posted their own stories of witnessing abuse, of being mistreated by authority, of wishing anyone had stood up for them the way Keanu had for Rosalía. Still, the noise was deafening. Keanu stayed silent through it all. He turned down every invitation to appear on television, declined the glossy magazine offers, the morning shows, the podcast appearances. His team released a single, typed statement to the press. Keanu respectfully declines interviews at this time. He believes the story belongs to the community it happened in. But the story didn't go away. Finally, after weeks of escalating noise, he made one exception. He agreed to appear on a small, independent talk show hosted by a longtime friend, a retired journalist, known for quiet interviews and honest dialogue. No audience, no panel, just 2 chairs, 2 glasses of water, and 1 camera. The interview began with silence. The host, a gray-haired man named Marcus Fields, leaned forward gently. "Why now?" Keanu sat with his hands folded in his lap, his posture calm, but his voice carried weight. "Because this isn't about me," he said. "It never was. But the noise has gotten so loud, I think people are starting to forget what really happened." Marcus nodded. "What did happen, in your eyes?" Keanu exhaled softly. "A woman was being mistreated, not because she was a threat, but because she was easy to ignore. I saw myself in that moment. What would I be if I stayed silent?" "What does it cost a man to just kneel down and say, 'This is wrong'?" The host paused. "You've been called anti-cop." "I'm not anti-anyone," Keanu replied. "I'm anti-abuse. This wasn't about sides. It was about doing what's right, period." That one sentence made headlines the next day. It cut through the noise like a beam of clarity. But not everyone heard it. Within hours, the same networks who criticized him dissected every word. Some mocked his appearance on a softball show. Others accused him of walking a tightrope, trying to stay likable. Some local stations tried to pit him against Lieutenant Mendez, saying his quiet protest undermined the captain's department. Still, Keanu said nothing more. He returned home, back to his quiet life. But what he couldn't avoid were the letters. Hundreds arrived over the course of a few weeks. His agent stopped forwarding them after the 4th box. Keanu had to pick them up himself, paper bags full of envelopes written in every kind of handwriting. Children, veterans, immigrants, nurses, teachers, even a few retired officers. One night, unable to sleep, he sat on the floor and opened a handful. There was one letter that stopped him cold. It was written in purple crayon, the handwriting uneven but sincere. "Dear Mr. Keanu," it began. "My name is Lily. I'm 7. My mom cried when she saw what you did. She said the world needs more people like you. I never met someone who made me feel safe before. But when I saw you kneel next to that grandma, I thought, maybe there's hope. The last line read, "You made me feel safe again." Keanu closed his eyes, the letter pressed to his chest. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he kept reading one letter after another. Some were raw with pain, others filled with gratitude. Many said the same thing in different ways. "You reminded me I matter." The hate mail came too. A few cruel messages printed on thick cardstock, some with threats, others filled with bitterness. But they were few, drowned out by the tide of humanity rising to say thank you. The cost had been high, but the message was louder now. One act of quiet defiance had pierced through cynicism, media spin, and political noise. Keanu never claimed to be a hero, but to a 7-year-old girl with purple crayon, he had become a symbol of something that felt lost in the world: dignity, kindness, courage. As the weeks rolled on, the media storm began to settle, but the impact lingered. One morning, Keanu received a package with no return address. Inside was a small canvas, a child's painting. It showed a stick figure man kneeling next to a stick figure woman with gray hair. Above them, the sky was bright blue. In bold, shaky letters, it read, "Good guys kneel." Taped to the back was a note. "Dear Mr. Keanu, I painted this in art class. I told my teacher it was about being brave. She cried. I hope you like it. Lily." Keanu placed it on his bookshelf, right beside a black and white photo of his late mother. He said nothing to the press, no tweets, no statements, just a silent thank you, spoken in the way he lived, in quiet actions. He returned to his films, declined all political requests, and went back to visiting hospitals, shelters, libraries away from cameras, just as he had before. But something had shifted. The world had seen a side of him that couldn't be unseen. Not a star, not a rebel, but a man who knelt not for attention, but because someone had to, and the world remembered. It started with one bench in one park. Now it was everywhere. The initiative that began with a battered wooden seat beside a grocery store in East LA had evolved into a national campaign. The name Numbers Safe Bench had taken on a life of its own. Within months, cities from Seattle to Miami had reached out, requesting guidance on how to launch their own programs. Parks in 18 cities across the U.S. had designated safe bench zones near shopping centers, bus stops, clinics, and markets where elderly citizens could rest, wait, and be watched over by volunteers committed to compassion. It wasn't just a trend. It became a standard, a symbol. And it didn't happen through press releases or celebrity endorsements. It happened because people saw themselves in Rosalia's story. In the grainy footage of an old woman being shoved to the ground by officers meant to protect her. In the sight of a man kneeling beside her, arms shielding her from harm. It was raw, human, and it struck a chord that couldn't be ignored. In Chicago, a Vietnam veteran named Earl began standing near his neighborhood's safe bench every morning with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair. "I don't move too fast these days," he'd joke, "but I can call 911 just fine." Local news ran a story about him. Soon, others joined. In Portland, a retired kindergarten teacher offered sidewalk chalk to kids who stopped near her assigned bench. They drew flowers, hearts, and pictures of their grandparents. In Atlanta, a community center turned its foyer into a safe bench lounge where volunteers rotated in 4-hour shifts. Some read aloud from newspapers. Others just sat in quiet companionship beside strangers who were no longer invisible. And then came the celebrity wave. Without prompting, a few high-profile actors and musicians began showing up at their hometown safe bench spots, not to perform, not to be seen, but to serve. A famous country singer quietly spent his Sunday afternoons handing out water bottles in a Nashville park. A beloved television actress sat in New York's Washington Square Park, knitting scarves and listening to stories from elders who hadn't had someone to talk to in months. And still, Keanu Reeves stayed mostly in the background. He declined offers to appear on magazine covers featuring the safe bench movement. He turned down brand sponsorships. He even refused a well-intentioned request to have his name permanently engraved into the original East LA bench. His reason was simple. "This was never about me," he told a local organizer. "If people start seeing my face instead of their neighbors, the whole point gets lost." Instead, Keanu quietly funded the infrastructure to help the movement grow. He provided grants to cities struggling with resources. He donated equipment for accessible seating. He sent funds to nonprofits focused on elder care and neighborhood safety. And when he did appear, it was always unannounced, just long enough to shake hands, smile, and thank the people actually doing the work. The movement didn't need his spotlight, it needed his example. And so it spread. The ripple effects went far beyond the benches themselves. Elementary schools began adopting kindness corners, inspired by Safe Bench, where students were encouraged to sit and talk with someone who looked lonely. Some schools even assigned bench buddies kids, who volunteered to keep an eye out for others who needed a friend. It wasn't just elder care anymore. It had become a culture of watchfulness, of care, of community. In Houston, a new park was built with Rosalia's name carved into the marble arch over the entrance. Rosalía Park, where everyone deserves to be seen. Beneath it sat a handcrafted safe bench made of reclaimed wood, each slat engraved with a word submitted by community members: respect, hope, listen, belong. Even law enforcement was taking notice. Some departments, once resistant or defensive, began requesting workshops from the Safe Bench organizers. Officers were retrained not just on use of force policy, but on the human aspect of community protection. One sheriff in Minnesota made Safe Bench patrols part of his rookie training. "If you can't sit beside someone who's struggling and just be still," he told his cadets, "you're not ready to wear the badge." Rosalía herself was stunned by the scale. She still lived in her small apartment above the bakery in East LA. She still took the bus twice a week, but now people stopped her. Strangers smiled at her on the street. A little boy once handed her a drawing of her sitting on the bench with Keanu beside her, arms outstretched. It made her cry on the sidewalk. But the most unexpected shift came from her own family. Her granddaughter Mariela had always been bright, but like many young women of color, she struggled with feeling overlooked. Her college experience had been marked by quiet dismissals, the kind you couldn't always prove but felt. She'd considered giving up on her dream of law school. "I thought maybe justice just wasn't made for people like us," she admitted one evening as the family gathered for dinner. But something changed. Watching the world respond to her grandmother with such reverence, such empathy, it rewrote something inside her. She reapplied to law school, wrote a new personal statement, centered not on her own resume but on Rosalía's story. "My grandmother taught me that being small doesn't mean being powerless," she wrote, "and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is just staying seated until someone finally listens." When she got her acceptance letter, Rosalía wept into two pride. Her scarf. "I never imagined I'd see the day," she whispered. "My pain turned into her path." And that night, in a candlelit church hall where neighbors gathered to celebrate Mariela's news, Rosalía stood at the front of the room with trembling hands. She wasn't a public speaker. She didn't speak loudly or with practiced gestures, but the room hushed. "I lived a long time thinking I was invisible," she said, "that the world had passed me by. But I see now. I was just waiting for the right moment, the right reason. I was never invisible. I was just waiting for all of you." She paused, eyes shimmering. "And now," she added softly, "we're building something I never dreamed I'd live to see." The evening sky over MacArthur Park glowed with streaks of orange and violet as hundreds of people gathered for the anniversary event. A year had passed since the moment that transformed an ordinary afternoon into a story that reverberated across the nation. What had once been a park where Rosalía was humiliated and broken down had become a place of honor, renewal, and hope. Rows of folding chairs lined the grassy field near the pond. Lanterns hung from the trees, swaying lightly in the breeze. Families brought blankets. Children carried paper candles decorated with words like justice, love, and courage. Elderly couples held hands, leaning against one another, their faces solemn but proud. The benches, once overlooked, battered, and ignored, now bore bronze plaques with the Safe Bench logo, a small engraving of two hands clasped together. At the center of it all was a wide stage built with reclaimed wood, simple and unadorned. On its front banner were the words, "The Day the Park Changed." There was no corporate sponsor, no political branding, no product tie-ins, just a community returning to the place where silence had been broken. Rosalía arrived with her family just as the first notes of soft guitar music floated through the speakers. She wore a cream dress with a delicate shawl embroidered by her granddaughter. Time had slowed her steps, but her spirit seemed lighter than ever. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she looked around the park she had once feared returning to. Now it was filled with people who had come to celebrate her resilience and the message her story had carried across the country. Keanu walked beside her, hands tucked into his black blazer pockets. The crowd noticed. Of course, they always did, but he wasn't announced, introduced, or spotlighted. He walked quietly, his presence acknowledged only by a ripple of respect as people rose to their feet. He bowed slightly in return, then continued alongside Rosalía until they reached their seats. Near the stage, the ceremony began with music, a local choir humming a medley of spirituals that spoke of endurance and hope. Then came testimonies. Veterans, teachers, young people, mothers, and elders all shared how that one day had given them courage to speak up when they had been silent before. Each voice, each memory, tied back to Rosalía's moment of being seen. Finally, as the sun dipped lower, the screen lit up with the first frames of the documentary. Its title appeared in quiet white letters, "The Day the Park Changed." There was no narration, no dramatic voiceover, only raw footage from cell phones and cameras, edited together with careful pacing, and accompanied by the gentle strains of strings and piano. The sound of the officers shouting, the thud of Rosalía hitting the ground, the hush of the crowd. Then, the calm, firm voice of Keanu saying, "Let her go." The silence of the film spoke louder than any commentary could. It wasn't manipulated, it wasn't dramatized. It was simply the truth, laid bare for everyone to witness again. When the film ended, there were no immediate cheers, just a long, heavy silence. People wiped their eyes, couples leaned into each other, even children sat still, sensing the weight of what they'd seen. It was the kind of silence that meant something had landed deep inside. And then, slowly, the applause began. It swelled, wave after wave, until the park vibrated with it. Rosalía rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned on her cane. Her family moved to help her, but she waved them off with a gentle smile. Step by step, she made her way to the stage. The crowd quieted again, and all eyes turned to her. She stood before the microphone, but for a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes scanned the crowd faces of every color, age, and background. Then she took a breath and began. "I spent most of my life believing I was invisible," she said softly. "I came to this country with a dream in my heart and a broom in my hand. I worked. I raised my children. I sat on park benches and watched life pass by. I never thought anyone would notice me until they threw me to the ground like I didn't matter. And that's when you all stood up." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "You didn't just stand for me. You stood for your mothers, your abuelas, your neighbors, the strangers you walk by and never speak to. You told the world that dignity matters, that silence is not peace, that kindness is not weakness." And that day changed everything. The crowd stood again, some clapping, others weeping. Rosalía smiled through her tears. "And if there's one thing I ask of you," she said, "it's this. Don't wait for someone like Keanu to be nearby. Don't wait for a camera. If you see injustice, speak. If you see someone hurting, act. Even a whisper can break a wall." She stepped down slowly. As she returned to her seat, Keanu rose. He didn't mount the stage. He didn't grab the microphone. He walked to the front of the crowd, turned to face them, and waited until the murmurs fell away. "I've said enough this year," he began. "But tonight, I want to leave you with something short. He looked out across the audience. The children, the elders, the activists, the skeptics, the ones still healing. We saw. We stood. We changed, he said. Let's keep going. And then he stepped back. The crowd was quiet again, but it wasn't empty silence. It was full, charged, sacred, electric. One by one, hands went up. Not fists, not signs, just hands. Palms open toward the sky. A gesture that had no words, but meant everything. As night descended on MacArthur Park, the soft glow of paper lanterns floated across the lake. Each one carried a handwritten message of thanks, a name remembered, or a promise to do better. They drifted together, slowly forming a cluster of light. Rosalía sat on the same bench where it had all begun, only now her granddaughter sat beside her, notebook in hand, writing everything she could remember. The young girl had decided weeks ago that she would study law. Her dream was to fight for people like her grandmother, people whose names didn't make headlines but whose lives deserved protection. "Did I do okay, abuela?" she asked, looking up. Rosalía nodded, brushing a hand across the girl's hair. "You're doing better than okay, mija. You're rewriting the future." The girl smiled and kept writing. Keanu stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed again, just as he preferred. He watched the family together, the soft glow around them, the bench that had become a symbol. He didn't need recognition. He didn't want it. What mattered had already happened. The story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them, to the ones who watched, to the ones who listened, to the ones who acted. This wasn't just a story about Keanu Reeves, the actor. It was a story about a man who chose to act when it mattered. A man who could have turned away, who could have shrugged and kept walking, who could have watched injustice unfold from a safe distance and stayed silent. But he didn't. He saw something wrong, and he stepped in. That moment in the park was never about fame or headlines. It wasn't about politics or proving a point. It was about dignity, about standing up for someone others overlooked, about recognizing that silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of violence. Rosalía had lived in that silence for decades. She had worked hard, paid her dues, and asked for little. But in the eyes of those who tackled her, she was disposable, unimportant, a burden. That lie had lived too long, not just in MacArthur Park, but in too many corners of society. And yet, the moment someone stood beside her really stood, without fear or fanfare, everything changed. A single act didn't fix the world, but it started something. It started a conversation, then a movement, then a legacy. Keanu didn't build monuments. He didn't give speeches soaked in applause. He gave something more difficult. He gave his presence. He gave his name. And then he gave it away so others could carry the message forward, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That's what made the difference. Because when dignity becomes collective, when one person's pain becomes everyone's responsibility, something beautiful begins to take shape. It's easy to believe that justice is someone else's job, that movements are born in conference rooms or courts. But more often than not, they begin on benches, in silence, in parks, in glances that hold too long, or in footsteps that choose to stay rather than flee. Justice isn't found in silence. It's born in resistance, quiet resistance, small defiance, ordinary courage. Maybe you've been in that moment. Maybe you've seen something you knew wasn't right. Someone being harassed, mocked, dismissed, or hurt. Maybe you didn't know what to do. Maybe fear held you back. Maybe you walked away, heart heavy, but hands still. You're not alone. That hesitation doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But here's the truth. Every moment is a chance to rewrite the one before. Every step forward is one someone else might follow. You don't have to be Keanu Reeves to make a difference. You just have to care, to stop, to ask, to say, "Hey, are you okay?" Or, "That's not right." Or, simply to be present. The world doesn't need more heroes in capes. It needs more people who refuse to look away. One man's decision to stay at a park changed the life of a woman who thought she'd never be seen again. And through her, it changed the lives of hundreds, maybe thousands, one day, maybe millions. All because he stayed. So now, it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed something unfair and didn't know what to do? Would you have stepped in like Keanu? Drop a comment below and share your incredible story. Tell us about a moment when you chose to speak up or wish you had. Your voice might inspire someone else to act next time. And if you believe in dignity, justice, and compassion, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this. We're not just telling stories, we're building something together. This story may have started with Keanu Reeves, but it lives on in every quiet act of courage that followed, in every park that now has a safe bench, in every elderly woman who walks without fear, in every young person who dares to say, "I can help." That ripple began with a moment, just one, but it kept moving because people chose to carry it forward. What made this different wasn't the scale, it was the sincerity. Keanu never asked for attention. He never demanded credit. He gave the story back to the people who needed it, to Rosalía, to the communities who felt invisible, to every person who has ever been told, in word or in gesture, that they don't matter. And somehow, by doing less, he did more. That's the secret most movements forget. It's not about shining brighter, it's about helping others feel seen. In the end, Rosalía didn't need a rescue. She needed respect. She needed someone to say, "You shouldn't have to scream to be protected." And Keanu didn't play the savior. He played the witness. He saw her. And sometimes, being seen is the beginning of being safe. The moment he sat down beside her, he gave others permission to do the same, not just in MacArthur Park, but in cities and towns around the world. He reminded people that compassion isn't weakness, that courage doesn't have to be loud, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stay. Stay when it's uncomfortable. Stay when others leave. Stay when you're scared. Stay because silence is heavy, and someone shouldn't have to carry it alone. This was never about police or politics. It was about people. And in a world spinning fast with anger, distraction, and noise, a moment of stillness, and a man sitting beside a woman others ignored, cut through everything. It reminded us of something deeper, that justice is not a trend. It's a promise that everyone, regardless of age, color, background, or income, deserves to feel safe in public spaces, that no one should be tackled for existing, and that when we protect the most vulnerable among us, we protect the soul of our society. If you felt something while watching this, don't let that feeling pass. Let it settle, let it grow, then let it guide your next decision. Maybe it's helping someone cross the street. Maybe it's reporting a wrong. Maybe it's telling a story that deserves to be heard. Start small. Start now. Because the next moment that needs you won't come with music. It won't wait for cameras. It will come quietly, without warning. And in that moment, you'll remember this story. You'll remember Rosalía. And you'll remember what one man chose to do when he could have done nothing. So if this incredible story moved you, we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed something unfair and didn't know what to do? Would you have stepped in like Keanu? Leave a comment below and share your own incredible story. Your words could change someone else's path. And if you believe in kindness, dignity, and everyday courage, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one. Because sometimes, a bench isn't just a place to rest. It's where history changes, quietly, forever.